issue, tried to explain to me.
And he wanted to know that what he could do if they would
In more greater cities, becoming monuments to the courage and faith of the undaunted Americans. Buffalo hunter who with his great show made the old West. From these broken streets.
Hi, my name is Matt Scott, and you're watching The History Show, and it's my pleasure today to welcome a very special guest. He's an old friend that goes back to the last century with me, our relationship. Locke is what we call him. He's also known as Norman Locke, or Norman Churchill Locke. This is part of a program that we're working in conjunction with the Library of Congress and the Chelmsford Senior Center, which is we're interviewing veterans, especially veterans who've served in different wars in the United States. And if you have somebody or you know somebody you'd be interested in getting interviewed, these tapes are being archived at the, and there's a registry being created at the Library of Congress. And one of the neat things about it is that this is going to be part of a permanent collection so that researchers and reporters and journalists or whoever in the future can go back to these archives and actually hear the oral histories of people who participated in some of these great campaigns. And not just 50 years from now, but I mean, these will hopefully be there 500 years from now, and perhaps even 1,000 years from now. They're going to be part of a permanent collection. And if you can imagine somebody 1,000 years from now going to Cy Norman Locke to get his story, it would be, equal to us being able to have access to somebody from the Middle Ages and, hear their oral history. But you weren't around at the Middle Ages, though, were you?
No.
Yeah. So Cy, welcome to the program.
Not knowingly,
here.
At least, Matt.
Now, you have a, right before we get into your adventures in the Coast Guard during World War II, you do have quite a long history back in this area. You grew up in Billerica.
Yes.
Your father was the principal of the House School, and it was, that was when this was the country, wasn't it?
Very much so, Matt, very much so. Very rural. There were a lot of farms in Billerica and Chelmsford and so forth. I actually was born in Red Deer, Alberta, Canada, and moved here when I was 2 years old, when my father was appointed principal of the high school in Billerica. But it's a dramatic difference from what it is now, of course. There were about 5,000 people in Chelmsford and Billerica. And I'm comparing the two because they were very similar in size and in population in those days.
So during that time, 1930s and stuff was when you were in middle school and you were in high school and stuff. It was also a time of, well, you've lived during, I think one of the most interesting centuries in history. You've certainly seen a lot and stuff, but there was, the kind of the buildup of Nazi Germany, of course, what was going on in Russia with Stalin, Japan, the Pacific. Were you aware of, as a kid, about the world events going on, or were you somewhat oblivious to?
No, we were pretty much aware of it. We had, I remember we had one teacher in high school, a Miss Harriet Baker, who was. Well, I don't think I'm doing her a misjustice by saying that she wasn't the most attractive lady in town. She was about 6 feet tall, very raw-boned, but had a mind like a steel trap, Matt. And she was very interested in civics and in world affairs and so forth. And she made sure that we knew about it, too. Her primary teaching activity was in Latin and ancient history, but we could always get her going on current events. And we used to sometimes, if we hadn't done our homework, we'd try and pull her off the track by talking about this morning's Herald editorial. Have you read that, Miss Baker? And she would respond immediately, And she always knew what we were up to, though.
Were you, this was also a time before television. You did have newsreel in the theaters and stuff like that. But
Newsreels
what?
in
I
the
mean,
theaters.
we're a history of media and a history of. I mean, you were a professor of media and a professor of film and stuff. What kind of input? I mean, how, as far as, I mean, it's a lot different now where we're watching 24-hour news channels and radio and stuff. I mean, what was the radio like back then, listening to it?
Well, first, the movies, excuse me, you just touched on something when you said we have 24-hour coverage, which indeed we do. A newsreel would usually be 2 days to a week late, so you'd be seeing an event that had happened and was not immediate. Today, everything is immediate. Radio was more like television without pictures in those days in its immediacy. It was very interesting to note that when television came into being, it was taken over by the radio people, which accounted for time slots such as 15 minutes, 30 minutes, half hours, so forth. And in a way, it differs now on the cable channels. It approximates the way movies were in that it was allowed to roll until conclusion. In the early days of television, everything had to be cut to a time fabric, and you had to meet that clock. As you know, I started out in Channel 7 in Boston when I got out of college, and one of the things that was particularly annoying was always watching that clock and knowing that when it hit that certain point, you were off the air or you were on the air.
Do you remember while you were growing up, at night when the family would gather around, would you gather around the radio and listen to the news or something? Or what would be coming, or was it all entertainment?
Well, we'd listen to both, but my father had a great sense of humor. He loved the radio comics. Fred Allen was his great favorite. You ask people who Fred Allen is today, they have very little idea, but he was a very witty man, Fred Allen, and that appealed very much to my father. And he liked Jack Benny, of course, and he liked Eddie Cantor and all these other people. So it was very much a family affair. And when there was nothing on, the radio was turned off. And crossword puzzles were done, or certain things. Hopefully, some homework got in there too.
Yeah. Do you remember? You were probably still in high school, for instance, when the Battle of Britain began, when
Yes.
Poland was invaded, when we did see this rising of this Nazi Germany, basically, and stuff. Do you remember listening at all to like Edward R. Murrow?
Oh yes.
What was that like? I mean,
well, it was at the same time as we talk a lot about reality today, reality television and so forth. This was reality, but at the same time it was surreal. Surreal in listening to, for example, a speech by Adolf Hitler. This ranting and raving and screaming and so forth, in a language that none of us understood, of course. But somehow it seemed to penetrate that this particular individual had the capacity to mesmerize the people of Germany into believing what he wanted them to believe. Of course, there were a lot of other factors at work there. There was the fact that the country had been decimated at the end of World War I, and that the truce was particularly harsh. The French demanded a lot. The British demanded a lot. And the people of Germany went through, as we did, a horrible depression, although theirs was far worse than ours. I mean, it would take a wheelbarrow full of marks to buy a loaf of bread, for example, in those days. And so it was very interesting. I must be perfectly frank and say I don't think I paid that much attention to it, in the sense that we do today as adults. But it was there, and it was sad to see it happen the way it did, because it could have been stopped.
yeah. Now, you also mentioned the Depression, which was, happening during the 30s when you were growing up and stuff. Fortunately, your father had a good job as a principal and stuff. But did you see the effects of the
absolutely.
In the general area and stuff?
Absolutely, sure. And you're right. My father had a job. We were very fortunate that he had a job. This did not mean, however, that we could have anything we wanted. I mean, in those days, I remember I wanted a pony, and my father looked at me and he said, "Are you insane?" But anyway, and I bought my first bicycle by my paper route money and that sort of thing. I didn't feel deprived because everybody else was deprived, but there were families in these towns, small towns, and in Lowell that were in very dire situations. And I recall as a child going into the square, the main square in Lowell, and seeing little kids dressed in hand-me-downs and clothing from places like the Salvation Army and Goodwill, standing on the sidewalk selling newspapers in shining shoes. And it was tough.
Yeah.
And in many instances, what those little kids were able to garner was all that family had, because the father would not be able to find work.
Yeah.
It was desperate times.
It was also a period of time, I mean, you mentioned Adolf Hitler and stuff, but it was Franklin Roosevelt. It was not yet Winston Churchill to the war, but it was Stalin and stuff. I mean, there were these great figures of history and these, speeches and stuff like that. I mean, were you aware of kind of this dramatic chapters of history unfolding in front of you? Or, I mean, were you aware, for instance, of, Franklin Roosevelt, that you were listening to somebody that, like him or not, was a major figure of history who would be remembered probably for centuries?
It's very interesting, Matt, that you've hit on this particular point, because I don't know, perhaps in ancient times we had a similar situation, but it is interesting to note that at that particular time we had what I consider the three greatest orators of our time on the stage, in Churchill, Hitler, and Roosevelt. Say what you will about Hitler's mental condition and his behavior toward people, the man was a master orator. He knew exactly how to play a crowd and handle them. There's no question about Churchill's abilities. I mean, Churchill knew far well that what he was telling the English people was something he couldn't deliver, but he said it in such a way that it lifted their spirits. And Roosevelt was a mesmerizer, an absolute mesmerizer. As you so cogently put it a short while ago, whether you agreed with him or not, you had to accept the fact that this man was a master speech maker. And, that fear, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, just seemed to lift everybody's spirits in those days. They badly needed lifting, I might add.
Now, you graduated from high school in 1940.
Right.
We were not at war. The United States was not at war yet.
Officially.
Did you, at that point when you graduated, did you think that we would soon be at war, or were you somewhat oblivious to that, possibly?
I think I was oblivious to it, Matt. I think I was a typical 17-year-old.
You were a musician, right? Were you already?
Well, I was starting to fool around with
okay.
it. Yeah. I think that, I was more concentrated on who my next girlfriend was going to be, and having a good time.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing, and also looking for work.
Sure.
I needed to get a job.
Did you not go to college when you, right, in 1940?
I went to Wentworth Institute after I got out of high school.
Okay.
But only lasted there for about 4 months, because I was not a good student. was the typical principal's son. You know, I was a terrible student, and I didn't do well at Wentworth. So my father said to all, "That's the end of that. Now you can just get yourself out and get yourself to work."
Okay.
So I went to work at the B&M Railroad in Billerica, the car shops there. This was the repair facility for the B&M Railroad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't think there was a kid in Billerica who did not at some time work for the B&M car
Now, this was
shop.
actually fixing trains, you mean? Or?
No, this was digging. I was the plumber's assistant.
Oh, okay.
So I used to dig drains.
Oh, really?
And stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then after I got a job working at a place called King's Incorporated in Lowell, which was an appliance store, sold small appliances and records. And with my love of jazz and all that stuff, this was like heaven to me.
Yeah.
To work in a place where I could sell records and listen to them all day long. And in those days, every store had listening booths. I remember we had 3. And if someone came in and wanted to purchase a record, they could take the record in the listening booth and listen to it and decide whether they wanted it or not.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, Matt, if there's one tune that sends me over the edge every time I hear it, it's Jingle, Jangle, Jingle. I heard that damn thing so many times.
Jingle, Jangle, Jingle by who?
It was by Horace Heidt and his Musical Nights. Oh, God, I hated that song. But, you know, the kids loved it.
Yeah.
You know, so they'd keep playing it over and over and over.
I'm curious, did they have like pop music radio stations back then?
Oh, yes.
Like they have now?
Oh, yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so they would play those songs.
They played, in those days, that was the days of the big bands, by the way.
Yeah.
And there were 3 kinds of big bands. There was a hot band. This would include Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, people who played pretty much jazz most of the time, or jazz-oriented pop songs. Then there was a semi-hot band, which would be Tommy Dorsey and his brother Jimmy Dorsey. They played a lot of jazz, but they would also play the very sentimental stuff that Frank Sinatra sang with Tommy Dorsey.
Yeah.
And then there would be the sweet band. Well, Glenn Miller was in that group too. And there'd be the sweet bands, and then there would be what we call the corn bands, like Guy Lombardo,
Yeah.
people like that we couldn't stand as
Right,
jazz.
yeah. But they
as
were still
jazz
popular.
acts. Oh, enormously popular.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Guy Lombardo's was a fixture at one of the hotels in New York on New Year's Eve, you know.
And this was also a period of time when you would go to a concert, it would be or there might be several different big bands there, right? I mean,
well, there was never such a thing as a concert in our days. A concert in our days was a symphonic presentation, like at Symphony Hall or someplace like that. We went to ballrooms and dance halls and hotels and things like that, where these bands played for dancing. They were primarily called dance bands, no matter whether they were jazz or hot or sweet or corny or whatever. And one of the best was in Lowell, by the way, the Commodore Ballroom. Excellent ballroom. And the finest ballroom in the United States, according to no less an authority than Ray McKinley, who was Glenn Miller's drummer in his Air Force band and had his own orchestra after the war, was the Totem Pole Ballroom in Auburndale, Mass. It was in Norumbega Park.
Yeah.
It's long gone, of course, but it was the most beautiful ballroom in the whole country.
Yeah.
And it was built on the side of a hill, was terraced. And they had a stage like this and then terraces that went up and big couches to sit on.
I'm sorry I missed that.
Very romantic.
Sorry I missed that.
Very.
Now, Cy, we are approaching 1941.
Yes.
The 30s have really been a pretty incredible decade. I mean,
Yes,
we
they
talked
have.
about some of the great historical figures. We talked about the Depression, the music, just the changes that were happening as far as technology and everything.
Right.
And both around the world and in the United States, well, the reshaping of kind of the global geography. There was incredible things going on. 1941, we had Pearl Harbor. Do you remember where you were?
Vividly. It was a Sunday afternoon, and we were going bowling. My friends and I had planned to go bowling. And just before, they had gathered at my house. And just before we left, my father had the radio on. He was listening to a football game, I remember. And he said, we were just leaving the house. He said, "Wait a minute, fellas." He says, "There's something coming on the radio." And that was the announcement that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And actually, I don't think we knew. We went bowling.
Yeah.
But I don't think we really grasped the full significance of what had happened here immediately. I was still going to Wentworth, I remember, and I had a radio in my car,
Yeah.
one of the first cars with a radio in it. And Roosevelt came on to make his speech declaring war,
Yeah.
or asking that Congress declare war. And we all gathered around the car and listened to this speech. And then it started to penetrate,
Yeah.
that we have gone to war.
Yeah. Now, you went into the United States Coast Guard.
Right.
Why?
Because I couldn't get in the Navy. I'm being a little facetious
Okay.
about this. I had received my draft card, my draft notice
Yeah.
from the Army, in other words, to report.
And when was that you received it? Out of curiosity, was
It
that?
was in the spring of 1942.
Okay.
And I didn't want to go in the Army. I don't know why, I just didn't want to go in the Army.
Yeah.
My uncle had been a captain of a fishing schooner, and my family lived in a seacoast town where I'd grown up. My father had grown up. So maybe it was in my genes that I wanted
Yeah.
to be at sea. So I took a day off from work and went into enlist in the Navy.
Okay.
And when I got there, there was a line around the block and around the next block. I thought, well, I don't want to stand there. I'll go for a walk and come back later.
Okay.
So I went for a walk and found myself in front of this building that said Coast Guard recruiting station. There was no one there.
Really?
So I walked in and I started talking to them. And the first thing I knew, I was in the Coast Guard. And that's how I got in that.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yep.
So basically, it came down to no lines.
That's right. First come, first served.
Okay. So
No waiting.
now, of course, the Coast Guard was actually assigned to the Navy
At that
during
point
that.
it was, yes.
Okay.
It before that had been part of the United States Treasury in, stopping people from bringing things into the States and so forth. But when war came, it went under the aegis of the Navy.
Okay.
So I actually was in the Navy, in the Coast Guard branch of the Navy.
Yeah. Now, you signed the paper there.
Yep.
You joined up. How soon were you shipping off to basic training?
I didn't leave until November of 1942.
So that was a
I
long.
signed up, I think it was in July I signed up.
Okay.
And then they finally got around to calling me. And I remember I got a telegram saying report 2nd Naval District headquarters.
Yeah.
And I assumed that I was just going in to be sworn in, and then I'd come home and wait again. Wrong. First thing I knew, I was on the train to New York. And,
Forlornly staring out the window.
yeah, right. And on my way to Manhattan Beach,
Wow.
which is where the Coast Guard Training Center was at that time.
Manhattan Beach
Manhattan Beach, New York.
in New York.
It's at the foot of, the foot of Coney Island. Foot of Brooklyn. There's Coney Island, Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Sheepshead Bay, all around the end of that peninsula there.
So, basic training for the Coast Guard. What was that like?
It was
back
a
then?
pain in the nether regions. I'll tell
Oh,
you
really?
that.
Well, you get
Walter Winchell referred to Manhattan Beach in his column. You remember Walter Winchell?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Walter Winchell referred to it as the only legalized concentration camp in America. And it was tough.
Really?
Yep. I remember meeting other fellows in the Coast Guard later on
Yeah.
who were trained at other places. And they'd say, "Where'd you do your boots?" And I'd say, "Manhattan Beach." "Manhattan Beach? Wow. You went through Manhattan Beach?" Yeah. So it had quite a reputation of being a tough place.
Can you talk about some of the things that you had to, what basic training was like? Or
Well,
maybe a day in the...
First day was a tremendous shock, of course.
The good times were over.
It was over, man. Very strict, extremely strict in there. And Manhattan Beach had been a resort area for moderate income people to go to in the summertime. And it was a collection of cottages until they built barracks later on. They were in the process of building those when I went there, by the way. And these cottages were designed to hold maybe 2 families at the most. So we had 50 guys in each one of these things, lined up in 3-tier sacks, as we call them, beds. 1 toilet, 1 little stove, and that was it. And every morning at 5 a.m., a guy came in and hit the end of that first bunk with a stick. Well, I don't have to tell you what was said and so forth. And we had 5 minutes to get up, get washed, get out on the parade field in front of the cottage. And everybody lined up, stiff as a board and so forth, half awake. And then the day was taken up with training, marching, training to march in order, I guess is the way you put it. I forget what it was. And then we'd go next door to the Marine training barracks, Maritime, excuse me, not Marine. The Maritime, where they trained the guys to sail the Liberty ships. And we used to have to jump into their tank over there and swim through burning oil and stuff like that. And then we had gas mask drill, I remember that. And then those very, very amusing short films. How to peel a potato.
Really?
How to load a rifle and things like that. You talk about boring.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. I don't know who used to make those things or direct them, but they were awful.
But I just want to place this. Would you describe the person who was going into the Coast Guard at this time as a serious-minded fellow, or was he more of a fun-loving?
No, it was all kinds.
But I'm talking about you at that
me?
point. Yeah, were you basically serious-minded, or were you somewhat of a, class clown or comedian, or just?
No. I didn't go in there to save the world.
Yeah.
If that's what you mean. I went in there because I had to.
Yeah.
At first, and I hope I had as much patriotism as the next guy, but it was not. I was not on fire to get into the service.
Sure.
I don't think I was the class clown. I tried to keep a sense of humor.
That would probably be difficult with your father as the as the principal.
I will tell you one thing, Matt. I thank God for my mother and father, for the way my mother and father brought me up. From the time I was a little kid, I had to make my own bed. I had to do all the other chores and things like that. And that kept me in good stead when I was in the service.
Okay, so I listen. We're going to end this part of the set. This is our first chapter. We're going to be back here with Locke next week for part 2. And we thank you for joining us.
trying to explain to me.
And he wanted to know that what he could do if they were to lose.
The world's greater cities become a monument to the courage and faith of the unsouthern Americans. Buffalo hunter who with his great show has used from these broken streets.
Hi, welcome back to the History Show, a program which we hear the oral histories of various people who have lived during this past century, and we have been concentrating for the last, we've done I guess about 9 or 10 right now on the oral histories of veterans from both the World War and Vietnam War. And we're back for our part 2 interview with Locke. If you know someone, or if you yourself would be interested in having your oral history done here down at Chelmsford Telemedia, you can contact either us or Allie Bassett over at the Chelmsford Senior Center. She's acting as kind of a coordinating producer for this program. She's doing a great job. And Cy, welcome back to our second part. When we had finished up, just to brief people who might have seen, might not have seen part 1, is we talked a little about the events preceding to your enlistment in the United States Coast Guard. And you grew up during the 30s. Your father was the principal of the house school. You grew up in Billerica, and basically were, a nice young man who, worked around town, had a lot of friends, and, had probably a good deal of fun. 1941 happened, and shortly thereafter, you had joined up with the Coast Guard because the line was shorter there. When we last finished, you were were in basic training in Manhattan Beach at the near Coney Island in New York, which seemed like a very somewhat painful experience to you. How long was basic training at with the Coast Guard?
4 months.
Okay, and
I was there from November to December, January, February.
Had you been involved with boats at all before that? I mean, were you somewhat familiar with some of the protocol or anything?
No, I was not involved that much. As a matter of fact, my only experience had been going to Nova Scotia twice from Boston when they used to run a ship from Boston to Nova Scotia. That had been about the size of it.
How much sea training did you have during the basic training? Were you,
the only boats we were in were the life-saving boats, these big life-saving boats, and we'd row out into the harbor in those and back in, and that was about the end that was it. For sea training.
So all of you went through the same, it was the same basic training.
Yep, all the same.
At the end of that 4 months, you were assigned to what?
At the end of 4 months, I went down to Norfolk, Virginia, and then out to a small island called Cobb Island off the coast of Oyster, Virginia.
Yeah.
I remember particularly was one enormous pile of oyster shells and about 6 houses.
Yeah.
That was it. And then Cobb Island was, I'd guess, maybe 10 miles off the shore there. And the job there was to protect these barrier islands from invasion by people from submarines.
Okay.
German submarines. And I never saw one.
Right.
But I can remember at one time there were 2 setups on this island. One was the Coast Guard station at one end of the island, and then 5 miles away was what's called a post house. And then 5 miles from that was the end of the island. So the island was 10 miles long.
Were there also civilians? Was there a town there?
No civilians.
Okay, so it was just except for the Coast Guard?
Just the Coast Guard station.
Was there a road or anything? Or
No. Well, no, I don't remember a road. There was a swamp between the main station and the post house that we used to have to go through to get to the post house.
Now, just before we get into what that was like there, why did you get assigned there?
I don't know.
Were you undergoing any other specialized training or anything like that?
No, at that time, when we got to Norfolk and were sent out to this island, we were all tested to see if, what our mental capability was and so forth. And at that time, I was offered the chance to go to officers training school, which I dropped.
Oh, you did?
Stupidly.
Yeah.
At that point.
Why, out of curiosity?
I wanted to be one of the guys. I didn't want to leave my, actually,
Yeah.
I did not want to leave my pals.
Yeah.
You know, that was how mature I was
Yeah.
at that point. But anyway, I turned down the chance to go to officers training school.
Okay.
However, from Cobb Island, I did go to electrician's mate school in Boston,
Oh, but before we get to that, how long were you at Cobb Island?
6 months.
Oh, wow, you got to know the island pretty well.
I did. Know every speck of sand.
How long were you stationed? I mean, you were stationed there for 6 months. How many how many people were stationed on the island?
There were 13 in the post house with me.
Okay.
Now the post house was a log cabin, okay, on stilts, because of many times the water would wash underneath the building, you know, on a storm
Yeah.
coming off because Cobb Island was only about 3 feet above sea level, the highest point.
Was
so
it it all sand or was it?
Yeah, it was all sand and scrub bushes.
Oh,
and
scrub
things,
bushes,
yeah.
no trees or anything?
No trees. And so we had this post house and an outhouse.
Okay.
You know, I mean, everything was up to snuff there.
Yeah.
No electricity, so it was oil lamps.
No electricity?
No electricity. No,
Well, how
no.
wouldn't you have like radar or something? Or
No. What we did was patrol the island. See, in other words, we went out from the post house to the end of the island and back, and the fellows from the station would come out through the swamp to our post house and back. And that's how we patrolled the island, to keep saboteurs off,
This was on foot?
on foot.
Okay.
No
Now,
horses.
Out of curiosity,
Yeah.
and again, I didn't even know really that this island existed and stuff. Would the saboteurs really have wanted to come to that island?
There were instances of them landing on these barrier islands
Oh,
off
okay.
the coast, you know. So they just put everybody on all of them.
Right.
And ours was one of the less expansive, shall we say. But I can't describe this duty to you, Matt, because we only patrolled the island at night. During the day, we were left to do whatever we wanted to do.
Now, how come you only patrolled at night? Because that's
you
when they
could
would
see
be
'em
coming?
during the day.
Oh, okay.
From the
Okay, you could see
station
everything.
house,
Yeah.
See, the Coast Guard station had a tower on top of it. You could see the whole island from the tower. So it had to be patrolled at night because they couldn't see it at night.
Now, did you have to patrol on foot?
On foot. 5 miles up and 5 miles back.
Okay, and you would basically walk down.
And we'd go out every hour. 2 of us would go out every hour.
Yeah.
So it was covered at all times, you know. And it was fun when there was a thick fog, because you'd be walking along, you know, and suddenly see a storm had washed in a piece of driftwood, a tree
Yeah.
or something. You know. Halt! So we had one trigger-happy guy there that would shoot at anything.
Oh, right.
It was great. You had to be careful with him,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was the duty for that.
Now, there was no electricity, so were you not even getting radio so that you could hear
Portable
the news or
radio.
anything like that?
Some guy had an early portable radio that had a battery in it about that big. And we used to listen to, oh, God, I thought I'd never forget that man's name. He was a narrator, very popular narrator on radio. And his big thing was, there's good news tonight. Or, oh, there's bad news tonight. You'd always open the show with one or the other, you know,
Yeah.
so we'd know what the day was going to be.
So there were 13 of you at your end of the island, and then
Yeah.
at the post house, how many were there?
Oh, about 40.
Oh, wow. So there were quite a lot of people
Good-
patrolling
it
this
was a-
island there.
Yeah, it was a good-sized post house. I mean, good-sized Coast Guard station.
At that point, were you, I mean, after a couple months of doing this, what was did you guys think that there would actually, I mean, did you take it a little less seriously, or was it a very serious, were you very serious about it?
I think we took it less seriously.
Yeah.
You know, after we get used to it, and we figured, well, what the hell. Of course, we would blow them away if they ever came there.
Could you see, I mean, from that barrier island there, could you see the mainland? And
No.
how long would you have to
about
stay
10
there
miles
before
out.
you would get a leave to?
You had 2 weeks, and then you get 72 hours off. And in 72 hours, I used to leave there, go to Cape Charles, Virginia, get the train to New York, get into New York, wait 5 hours for the train to Boston, take the train to Boston, get in at 6 o'clock in the morning, go home, leave the house at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, get the train.
Oh,
But, you know, I was young.
yeah, I guess so.
And I'd go the whole time without sleep virtually.
Yeah.
Sleep on the train if you could.
Now, after
And
about...
that was something else I might add, train travel in those days.
That was,
Oh.
yeah.
Jams.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Now, so on the, after, you know, I mean, you were on the island for 5 or 6 months.
Right.
Did it get boring after a
Oh,
while?
tremendously, you know. Almost go crazy trying to think of things that
So what would the
occupy
guy spend the day doing? I mean, you were there with a bunch of guys on the post. There's no electricity.
Well,
You can't
we'd go
watch movies.
swimming. We'd go swimming
Okay.
and build a raft and fool around like that. And you're going to laugh at this. Play cops and robbers.
You were really?
Really? We had a .38, a rifle,
Yeah.
a flare gun, and I think that was about our armament. We take all the shells out of the .38s and go around bang, bang at one another, and until one day some guy forgot to take shell out and put one through the outhouse.
Oh, okay, but nobody was.
Yes, somebody was in there, but he didn't hit him.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
It went over his head. But that was the end of that.
Okay. Well, you were young.
Oh, yes.
Did you have what was the highest ranking officer on that?
A first-class seaman.
And was he a little bit older or?
Yeah, quite a bit older.
And so as far as, you know, you're 6 months at the island there and, you know, basically trying to entertain yourself. I guess you did see some pretty big storms blow in.
Quite a
there.
few.
Were you there for a hurricane at all?
No.
Okay. How did it happen that you went off to electrician school, did you say?
Electrician mate school.
Or
Well, first of all, I was interested in electricity, you know, sort of in with media and that.
I guess
all
probably
that.
more so since you didn't have any out there.
Exactly. Yeah, good point. And it was in Boston. So I thought, oh boy, I can go to school and be home.
Yeah.
So I went to electrician mate school, and for the first time...
Now, was that hard to get into? Or
fairly hard.
Okay.
And for the first time, was a successful student. As a matter of fact, I was an honor student there. And that pleased my father immensely to know that.
How long a school is that?
That was 9 weeks.
Okay, and did that just operate just like a school? I mean,
Yep.
Okay.
It was at Franklin Institute in Boston. And after I got out of there, I was sent to Whalehead Island, North Carolina, where I stayed for a week. Then I was reassigned to Portsmouth, Virginia, to what was called the captain of the port. Now, the captain of the port was a big installation in Portsmouth that housed the Coast Guard people who guarded the docks in Norfolk and Portsmouth and that sort of thing. And I was assigned as an electrician's mate there.
Were these very large Navy bases at the time?
Norfolk was the biggest in the East Coast.
Okay.
And that was across the river, across the Elizabeth River from Portsmouth, where I was.
And what was your job there?
Electrician's mate.
So what would that entail?
Running movies, for one thing. No, I was
Really?
a movie operator, and went around, changed light bulbs, and kept up the electrical plant, and that sort of thing, and played in the band.
Okay. Oh, you played in the band too. You got one surprise after another.
That was like, I'm telling you, that was a home. The captain of the port was a home
Oh, really?
during World War II. Yeah, I mean, had unlimited free access, unlimited liberty free gangway, that sort of thing. And, you know, it was like having a job.
How did you get involved with the band?
Oh, I was always interested in music, you know, so.
Were you already playing an instrument at the
I
time?
was playing drums, not that well.
Okay.
And so the band used to rehearse in the same hall where I ran the movies. And I got talking to them, and we got to be all good pals. And then from that cushy setup, which lasted about 6 months, I think. It's kind of hard to remember the
Sure.
dates now.
Yeah.
But, then I was notified I was going to sea.
Okay, right before we get into that, one other question. This might seem a little bit silly, but you were basically in charge at that point of running a movie projector, where they was showing movies on a nightly basis.
Yep.
Now, I guess the thing that I wonder about is you were in like a pretty large community with other movie theaters and stuff, but they felt that, I mean, the guys could not go out to the movie theaters there, or would they stay with you?
If they didn't have liberty,
Okay.
they had to stay in the barracks.
Okay.
Plus the fact we used to get all the first-run pictures before the theaters got them.
Oh, you would?
Oh, yeah.
Were those 60 millimeter or
No,
35?
35.
Oh, 35 millimeter.
They had a regular circuit, if you will, of service theaters in the Norfolk area, because there was Air Force, Navy, Marines, and that sort of thing. They all had their own separate theaters. And so we'd bicycle the prints around. And they'd come directly out of the distributing agency before they made the theaters.
How'd you like it? How
Oh, that was great.
During that time. So that was a
There
nice
were
period
two
of time.
of us. There were two operators.
Yeah.
And you know, if I was going to play in the band some night, I'd take the night off and he'd run the show.
So, okay, now we're getting off to you being assigned to a ship.
Right.
Okay, how did that happen, that you got assigned to the ship?
Well, they go through the rosters wherever they cut orders for the service. They go through the rosters and they see, well, here's an electrician's mate, here's the specified rate. You know, and we need this rate for this ship and so forth and so on. So that's how I was picked.
And what ship were you assigned to?
The U.S.S. New Bedford,
Okay.
a patrol frigate, which is roughly comparable to a destroyer escort. It's about the same length, about 250 feet long, and same armament,
How large a crew?
about 200 tops.
Okay.
When the crew was full, it always used to vary. I mean, with guys coming on, going off, but I'd say maybe a permanent crew nucleus of 150, and then, or maybe 200.
Had that ship had a previous history
No,
as
it
a
was
Navy
brand
ship?
new.
Oh, it was a brand new
Yeah.
ship.
It was built in the Great Lakes, floated down the Mississippi to Galveston, Texas, where I joined it.
And how was that transition?
Terrible. I mean, I just left the paradise. You know? And
At that, because you were in the band, you were running movies. I mean, you
Oh,
were
yeah, I
pretty
was
thinking
having a
this
great
military
time.
life is pretty good.
belonged to the Moose Club. And because the band, the guy who was commander of the captain of the port used to send the band out on various jobs, very proud of us.
Yeah.
And he booked us into the Moose Club and Virginia Beach and places like that. You know.
And this was a jazz band.
It was a dance band.
Okay, a dance band.
Swing
Okay.
band. You know.
Yeah.
So it was, it was a real shock, and I was somewhat terrified, if you will, to know I was actually going into combat.
Sure.
Perhaps. Maybe, And
And what year was this about?
this was in 1940, last part of 1943, early 1944, I think.
And what was your job on the ship?
Electrician's mate.
And which entailed,
Well, my primary duty was IC compass watch. Now, the compass was the master compass for the ship. There was also one up in the bridge, of course, that they steered by, but this was the master compass, and it had to be constantly watched to make sure nothing went off kilter on it. And it was in what was called the IC room, which was one deck below the mess deck, which was one deck below the main deck. So it was actually 2 decks down. And it was very well appointed, I remember, and a very nice room to be in. And it had all the switches for the guns, and it had all the intercom inputs. So you put a pair of phones on and listen to all the phone conversations throughout the ship, primarily, because all the guys on guns were phones and so forth. And the gun switches, the guns would not operate unless those were turned on. That was part of my job, was to make sure those were turned on if necessary. They were kept off so nobody would misfire one accidentally. And then they say compass watch. Everybody thought I sat there and stared at the thing for 4 hours. Oh, no, I didn't do that. But I also played records from there.
Yeah.
I was the ship DJ as well as movie operator.
Was this something you constructed yourself, or?
Yeah, I was unofficial. Shall we say, fun officer of the ship.
Okay.
Getting all the movies and all that stuff.
Oh, they had a movie theater on it too?
No movie theater, a projector.
Oh, projector, okay.
So we built a screen for the fantail and put the projector out there.
Was that 35 millimeter too?
No, that was 16.
Oh, 16, okay.
And so then...
but the transition, you said, was terrible. A shock to the system? Or?
Well, it was pretty remarkable because, of course, in shakedown I got seasick, and so did everybody else. But that's beside the point. And shakedown was to Bermuda, where we spent a couple days and were refused admittance because somebody had shrieked an obscenity at some young lady. So he wouldn't let us on the island after that. And I think one of we had an officer on the ship who was an English teacher. And this guy, everything had to be properly versed and so forth when he went on the horn. So they decided they'd let us go swimming while we were anchored off Bermuda since we couldn't go ashore. So officer comes, I won't name him to embarrass him, but officer comes on and says, "There will be a swimming party on the fantail at 1300 hours. Uniform will be swimming trunks." There was a howl. Uniform will be swimming trunks.
Now, just so we can set the scene for some people that, well, obviously, I don't know anything about it, but you're living, the day-to-day living on the New Bedford.
Yeah.
What was, basically, can you just take us through a day in the morning?
Everybody you had a watch, and mine was 12 to 4. Everybody was on 4-hour watches, and that meant midnight to 4 in the morning and noon till 4 in the afternoon.
Okay.
And the rest of the time was pretty much my own to do as I saw fit. Not so with the unrated ones. They keep them busy all the time. They would stand a watch, like a forward watch or a gun watch or something like that. And then they'd have extra duties to do, like painting and scraping and all the things that keep the ship up, But the rated people had their watches, and then not too much extra, unless, of course, there was some electrical work needed to be done. I'd do that on my off time and so forth. And you'd have your meals, of course, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And
was the food okay, out of curiosity?
Food was okay. There was a big propaganda campaign at that time for the folks at home. All the good stuff is going to the boys in the service, Well, somehow they must have kind of missed us a little bit there.
And then your sleeping quarters?
Sleeping quarters with triple tiered.
Yeah. I
had the top sack right next to the skin of the ship. I could hear the ocean against the side of the ship.
Yeah.
And lie there at night and think to myself, there's that much steel between me and the ocean, and if anybody ever hits this mother, I'm gone. And that was true.
Yeah, sure.
Uh,
So
that was about the size
you
of it.
adopted to the routine, though.
Oh yeah,
really
you got
quick.
well. If you were, we did 2 convoy trips to Iran, Africa, out of Philadelphia,
Okay.
and
How soon after?
very soon.
Okay.
Very soon after I got aboard.
Now, when you did a convoy, can you just tell us what that is?
Yeah, okay. There would be about 100 Liberty ships would be formed into this formation.
And the Liberty ships were the Merchant Marine.
Merchant Marine carrying cargoes to, in this case, Iran.
Okay.
And then there would be 5 or 6 escort vessels. There would be a point vessel, a rear guard vessel, 2 on the side, and maybe 1 scout. And the idea was to keep submarines away from these people, you know. And you were constantly patrolling around. You would constantly patrol around the formation, or if there was thick fog, you'd get into a certain formation and stay there, and run your radar and sonar to try and pick up echoes of any submarines.
How long would one of these convoys take?
5 to 6 days.
5 to 6 days.
Maybe depending on the weather. There was
Okay.
one was 7 days because the weather was so fierce, and it was fierce. Because we used to go the North Atlantic route and then down into the Mediterranean. And on the North Atlantic,
Instead of going directly
instead of
across.
going- and you'd zigzag a lot and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And some of those storms were just unbelievable.
But would you
North
lose any
Atlantic
ships during those, or?
I don't think we ever lost any ships.
But for some time.
We were never attacked except one time in going into the Mediterranean. We were strafed by Stukas. But other than that, there were no submarine attacks.
But the North Atlantic storm.
Oh,
I mean, were you starting
vicious.
to wonder if you were going to make it out of?
In that little half walnut we were on there, you know, I mean, that thing would go up in the air like that, and wham, and the whole ship would just vibrate and shake. You know, it's tremendous noise it would make when it would come down into the trough, and you'd say, you know, how does this thing stay afloat? But it did, of course.
I mean, would you be able to go out and actually look at it, or were you all basically?
If you wanted to take the chance of getting swept over the side, you could,
Yeah.
But
So when you went to Oran?
Oran,
Okay, which is located
Algeria.
in Algeria.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go in the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar,
Yeah.
Rock of Gibraltar, go to Iran, stay there a week maybe, and then go back.
Were you
Pick up
able
another
to
one
go
going
to
back.
take shore leave during that
Oh, yeah.
period of time? And
Yeah, it was very interesting. Iran was very interesting in those days.
so you could explore the country a little bit.
Just the city.
Okay, what was that like? I
You
mean,
wouldn't go out in the desert unless you were nuts. you
Yeah.
know,
what was the city like? I mean, was it
It was
pretty
the
wild?
most fascinating combination of poverty and obscene riches I've ever seen. I mean, there were enormously wealthy Arabs would wear purple, and beautiful clothing like that, and the rest would be in rags, literally in rags. And all women wore the veil over their face.
Right.
And
Okay, well, listen, Si, we've actually
That's the end
finished
of that.
another one.
Wow.
That's the end of that. But we got to come back for one more, okay?
right,
Because
okay.
we just got to Iran, and I know you have a whole other story to tell us about. You out in the Pacific Theater, too.
yes.
And so we're going to be right back, and thank you for joining us on this program.
rationing. And the Screen magazine, in its second issue, tried to explain to me that
And he wanted to know that what he could do if they would improve. In world greater cities, becoming monuments to the courage and faith of the unscored Americans. Buffalo hunter who with his great show made the old West. From these broken streets and thundering bullets.
Hi, welcome to the History Show. This is a program that we talk to various people who have, a lot of them lived incredible lives, have wonderful stories to tell. And we are recording these, archiving these, and working with the Chelmsford Senior Center, the National Library of Congress. We have a producer, Allie Bassett, who is works over at the Senior Center. If you know some people who would like to share their oral histories with us, some veterans from the United States or other militaries even, you can contact her over at the Chelmsford Senior Center. You can contact us too. This is the third part, and I knew it would be a three-parter that I'm here with Cy Locke, because once you start talking to him, you can't stop. And he is a veteran of the United States Coast Guard. He is someone who grew up in this area, who, like many people his age, lived through the Great Depression, listened to some of the great speech makers and historical figures of the 20th century, went on to, was a great drummer in his own right. I believe you're even an actor. Taught film history. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, might have even had him as a teacher over at Fitchburg State. Worked for TV stations, but we're basically concentrating on his history with the United States Coast Guard. And we finished up with you at our last show. You had finished your first convoy duty. You had had a relatively pleasant experience in the Coast Guard up to that point, working both in a band and as a film projector, and had some time on an island off the coast of Virginia too, one of the barrier islands. And when we finished, actually, you had were in port at Oran, which is part of Algeria, which was actually at one point occupied by the French.
That's correct.
As a matter of fact, I talked to somebody earlier, Charlie Holtzman, who was with, what's surprising is some of the first battles that we fought over in the European African theater were actually not against the Germans, but against the French. He fought against the French, one of the first troops that landed there, and which, I mean, I was aware that, the French were allies of the German. But I had not been aware that we had actually fought against the French during World War II. It didn't last very long. They were looking to come over to our side. But anyway, you're a young boy from Billerica, or a man at that point, but still relatively young. You're in this foreign, exotic port. What was it like to you? I mean, was it a shock to the system, or?
Yeah, it was, because I had never seen civilization like that in Billerica, obviously. But
so you had seen Casablanca, probably,
such
right?
extremes there, and we weren't mistreated in any way while we were there. We weren't there long enough. I was there long enough to sample their cognac, which was very good. But, it was pretty tightly regulated as to what we could do as well, because the last thing the United States government wanted was any of us yahoos going wacko over there and creating a problem with the current regime. So we were kept on pretty stiff line.
Yeah.
And I failed to mention that I was also an SP at that time, because while I'd been waiting,
you were?
Yeah, while I had been waiting for the ship. See, I had gone back to Manhattan Beach to wait for the ship, and while I was saying they had to do something with us while we were there, so I was chosen to be the co-SP with one of the permanent SPs at Coney Island. It's a pretty good gig, by the way. I mean, you get to see all the movies free.
Okay.
And saw Tirza and her bubble bath. a few other of the great attractions
Yeah.
down there in Coney Island.
So you were actually on the shore patrol
I was on
through
shore
Coney
patrol.
Island?
Yes, briefly.
Okay.
And but that stays on your record. You know, when I went aboard ship, it was on my record that I was had been an SP.
Okay. Was there a
So
lot of
every
special
time-
training involved with that, or?
Yeah, a fair amount.
Okay.
Be careful of what you do and so
Yeah.
forth. And, so whenever we'd come into port, I'd have to pull an SP routine for a while, depending on how long we were there. So, you know, that was a restriction on me to begin with. So I had to behave myself, is what I'm saying.
And they would assign you to the harbor, basically, or?
Wherever they needed somebody.
Okay.
Or if it was our ship, if I was representing our ship, I would be out in front of the ship.
Okay.
You know. And if we had any personnel that got into trouble, like that, you know, drunk or something like
Yeah.
that, I'd have to go pick them up and bring them back. But that stuck on my record, and that would occasionally show up.
Sure.
But so we had the 2 trips to Iran and the North Atlantic storms and so forth. And the ship came back to Boston to be refitted for what was called a weather ship, air sea rescue weather ship, which meant that they took and built on the, do you know what a fantail is? That's the back part of the
Sure,
ship. in other
okay.
words. Just up above the fantail, they built what they called a shack, weather shack. And we'd fly balloons out of it and take the weather and so forth and report back to whoever we had to report to.
When they were, what year are we at, just so?
We're at the latter part of, I'd say around fall of 1944
Okay.
now. And so then we got orders to go to the Pacific, to Guam, as a matter of fact. And so we went down and through the Panama Canal and out to Hawaii, and from Hawaii to Guam, past Eniwetok and places like that. And our job out there, actually, the war ended, the Japanese war ended, the whole war, I should say, ended just as we got to Honolulu.
Oh, okay.
So from that point on, we're non-combatant.
Sure.
Combatant. However, they still needed air sea rescue. They still needed patrol work. Still needed weather patrol. So we kept on to Guam, and from Guam we were sent out on 2-week, not reconnaissance, but 2-week patrols, I guess you'd call them, to a spot called Station X-Ray, Station Zebra, Station Yoke, or whatever. We'd go out there and we'd stay there for 2 weeks and go 5 miles one way, turn around, come back, and go 5 miles the other way. Just barely under steam, you know. That was unbelievable.
Why, out of curiosity?
To give back weather reports.
Okay.
And if any planes had to ditch, we were there to help rescue them. Air sea rescue is what we were called.
Yeah.
And there were fleets of ships from Guam would go out. Fleets of small ships like ours would go out and do this patrol work. Then after 2 weeks, you'd be relieved by another ship. You'd go back to Guam for R&R.
Yeah.
No.
And what was Guam like at that point?
Matt, I can only put it to you one way.
Okay.
If anybody ever wanted to go and live on Guam, they should have the in my opinion.
Oh, really?
In my humble, I know people who love it out there.
Well, I've got to tell you, someone who's, I spent a little time in the South Pacific, never at Guam and stuff, but I just imagine these islands, like South Pacific. Right, yeah.
And the moon over
right,
the
right.
sea.
The daiquiri on the
Sure.
beach there and
Yeah.
stuff.
It was like that, by the way.
Okay.
I'm not, forget the guitars and the ukes, but there were times at sea, if the sea was calm, for example, and it was a good part of the time, the sea was calm, this enormous moon would rise over the horizon, and there would be a path of the moonshine, if you will, straight from that to the ship. And it looked like you could step off the ship and walk
Oh, that's, yeah.
I mean, it was absolutely magnificent.
Yeah.
But in Guam, it was hot, it was humid, it rained twice a day on schedule, bucketfuls for about 5 minutes, and afterwards everything would just steam. You know? And it was so uncomfortable on ship. We used to sleep out on deck, you know, and everybody got rash and all the rest of it, you know.
How would you occupy your time while you were on? I mean, what would you be doing?
And, you know.
Were you getting movies?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Guam had a great movie.
Okay, were you the movie
And I
projector
used
guy
to go
then?
used to go ashore in the water taxi and get the movies, you know, and bring them out every night. And, you know, I always had my directions before I went. Don't bring back anything with so-and-so in it. You know?
What were some of the ones they didn't like? Do you remember?
They didn't like the love pictures, you know.
Okay.
They didn't like anything. And Joan Crawford was anathema to them.
Oh, really?
For some reason. So this is leading up to an anecdote.
Okay.
So one day I went ashore, and the fellow who ran the movie depot there was from Lynn, so of course we had a lot in common. Good buddies. And he used to save all the good stuff for us. You know, he'd put it aside.
Now, how many? There was a movie depot.
Yeah.
And how many movies would they have there?
Well, they'd get 5 prints of each movie, and they'd have maybe 100 movies.
Oh, wow! So,
hey, Guam was a big. Apra Harbor was a big place.
yeah.
And there were a lot of ships that they had to take care of, you know. So, but this guy would always sneak a good one aside for us, you know. So this one day I came in, he says, hey, he says, I had a run this morning. He says, the only thing I got left is Mildred Pierce with Joan Crawford. And I said, you gotta be kidding. You want me to take out a movie called Mildred Pierce with Joan Crawford? I said, you want me to come back here alive tomorrow? So anyway, I took it out there.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen it?
Just briefly, what's it about? Very quickly.
Well, I'll tell you in a moment.
Okay.
And so I had to announce what movie we had. Oh, that was absolute necessity. So tonight's movie will be Mildred Pierce with Joan Crawford. What? This roar went up, you know. Kill him! So, but they would watch anything. Because, I mean, entertainment was at a premium out there.
Yeah.
So after chow, everybody would drag the benches out and set them up out in the fantail. Well, the movie opens with Zachary Scott getting shot. You know, I mean, there's 2 shots and he drops.
Yeah.
From that point on, it was, wow. Guess which movie I was asked to repeat?
Mildred
Pierce.
Really?
They loved that.
Yeah.
Thing, you know, afterwards. Hey, we're sorry we said anything to you. But I've noticed something as we're talking here, Matt. I'm telling you the good parts, the fun parts,
sure,
and the laughable parts, because that's what I want to remember of that experience. I'm not telling you about my buddy who's at the bottom of Leyte Gulf, and some of the other guys.
Yeah.
Not telling you that, because the mind is wonderful in that way. It protects you.
Sure. Yeah.
It drives all the bad stuff, the loneliness, the ennui, the boredom, and it is boring. I mean, there's nothing like military duty for being bored, as well as fast action when it happens. But the times in between are terrible.
During that period of time, I mean, you were also basically looking over the remains of what had been, a major sea battlefield, the South Pacific. Yeah. Did you get to any of those places where battles were fought?
Yeah, we saw a lot of the damaged material that was left behind, the wrecked stuff, and
would you go out to some of the other islands or anything like that?
No, we didn't go to. We'd stop for fueling and things like that.
Yeah.
and we'd see evidences of what had happened there, you know. And the toughest part was the crosses.
Yeah.
You know. And,
What about, did you ever see like any of the Japanese prisoners
Oh,
or anything?
there
And
was some of them in Guam.
there were some of them, and so, I mean, were there hundreds of them, or?
I would say that because I got ashore a lot, you know, to go get the movies. So
Yeah.
they had work gangs of them there, you know, and they were, you know, looked like Japanese.
Yeah, yeah. What was it like, the war over? I mean, was there?
Well, when we finally were told we were going home, of course, everybody thought that was wonderful.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, you could get out of the service if you had amassed a certain number of points. And about a third of our crew could get off, so they did. They got off at Guam or at Honolulu and were flown home, you know. And at one point in Honolulu, our captain left the ship. So
Had he been your captain from the beginning?
no, we had 3 captains.
You had 3 captains. Okay.
No, this guy was the Pacific captain.
Okay.
And so he got off at Honolulu, and that left us without a captain. So one of the junior officers said, I'll volunteer to be captain. And they said, what the hell are you talking about? What do you know about being a captain? And he says, I don't have to be. We've got a quartermaster here who's got 35 years in the service. He can sail this thing anywhere, and he could.
Yeah.
A guy named Day, I remember. He could sail that ship blindfold, you know. So all we needed was a figurehead. So this guy volunteered, and he became the captain. And so back we went to San Francisco, which was very nice.
Yeah.
San Francisco is a beautiful city. And then finally I got clearance to go home, and they put us on a train, which was, that was another experience because there were boxcars.
Was this a train going all the way across the country?
It was going in that direction.
Oh.
It went several different ways
Okay.
before we got back to Boston.
Yeah.
But it was in a boxcar that had beds in it, you know, and tables and a stove and all this stuff.
Oh.
So it was sort of like pioneering it, Matt, you
Yeah.
know, when we came back. Yeah, we went through, remember, I don't know why I remember Flagstaff, New Mexico.
Flagstaff, Arizona.
Arizona, I'm
Yeah.
excuse. Yeah, see, yeah, I remember it real well. Why I remember that stop, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I do remember that one very well. And
How
then
long was
just
that train trip, out of curiosity?
2 days. No, wait a minute, 3 days.
3 days. Yeah. How was your transition from being in the Coast? Did you think of staying in the Coast Guard? Because the Coast Guard, obviously.
We were propositioned, you know.
Yeah.
When
And they have a strong. I mean, that
they-
became part of the Department of Transportation.
Yeah. No, they put on a real campaign to
Yeah.
try and sign you back up, but oh no, I didn't want it. I wanted home. You know. And it was hard to describe what it was like to suddenly be, quote, free, because the military is a very disciplined situation. Even after the war, there were still restrictions, you know,
Yeah.
that you could do. There's an enormous gulf between officers and enlisted men, you know, and their living conditions and the way they approached one another and so forth.
You'd also been on a ship for a number of years, right
Yeah.
from the very beginning. I mean,
Right
were
from
there a
the
lot of
start of
other
the ship,
guys?
yeah.
You must have developed some pretty strong
Oh, I did,
relationships.
yeah. I still have some real. As a matter of fact, I talked to a guy last year I hadn't spoken to in 50 years. And that was great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I mean, have there been reunions or anything?
they have, but I haven't been to any of them.
Oh, okay.
I'm not very big on reunions, Matt. I like small groups and face-to-face and stuff like
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the change was really dramatic. Getting used to not to the routine.
Sure. Well, there's no one giving you orders
There's nobody
anymore.
giving me orders,
Yeah.
except my mother. But she had a tough time realizing that I was no longer her 17-year-old son.
Sure.
Because now I was 23 years old, 24 years old, and back home. No, wait a minute. More than that. It's 26 years old.
26 years old. Okay.
And I'd been around the block, you
Yeah.
might say, and the whole relationship was different. I was no longer her son. I was not her equal by any means, but I was an adult.
Sure. Yeah.
And it was tough. I finally had to leave the house and move to Boston.
Yeah.
'Cause, bless her soul, she'd want to know where I was going, what time I'd be home, and
Yeah.
so forth. I'd say, Mom, I may be gone for 4 days,
Yeah.
4 days? Where are you?
You're grounded.
Yeah, right.
And you had been to Africa. Were you ever in Europe
No.
back then? Okay.
Unfortunately, the one place I wanted to go to, I never got to,
Yeah.
and that was the British Isles. I always wanted to go to England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland, and never made it.
And then had you been in South America at all?
No.
Okay. You had
I
just.
never went further south than North Carolina.
Except when you were sailing through the Panama Canal.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. And then you had saw a lot of ocean in the South Pacific and stuff.
Yeah, a ship, some fellow made up a composite picture of the ship and a map of where it had been. And he figured out that it went over 75,000 miles.
Wow. Now,
and you know what was wonderful about this? Let me give you a little wonderful anecdote here. We came into Honolulu. There was an aircraft carrier. It just pulled in, and it was like looking up the Empire State Building, of course, from our little ship. And it was staffed by guys who had just come out of Great Lakes Training School. Boots, in other words, And they're looking down. Of course, the Coast Guard uniform had a shield on it. That's what differentiated us from the Navy. The only thing that differentiated us from the Navy. And these guys are looking down. They spot the shields. They say, "Hey, bathtub Navy! Bathtub Navy!" They're barely wet behind the ears,
Sure.
And he's, okay. That's what you think,
Were a lot of the guys who you were on the ship, were a lot of them on from the beginning?
Yep.
And so, how'd you get along how many years was that? Was that?
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years. How?
Well,
were relations good, or did
it
you
was
start
an
getting?
interesting thing, the like attracts alike, I guess, and so they would break down in a sort of I hate to use this term, but sort of a stratus type thing, because a ship's company, particularly at that time, would range from anything from a near moron up to a PhD capability person. So that would break up, and then your interests. If you found some guy who had the same interest as you had, like I had this great interest in jazz, so there were about 6 or 7 guys on the ship that were that way, and we'd all get together and listen to jazz, and so because the services used to send around these transcriptions. They're about that big. They used to run at 33 1/3. They were the predecessor of the LP record, if you will. And they'd have a half-hour show from some ballroom or some place like that of Gene Krupa or Benny Goodman, all this. So we'd listen to all that stuff, and that was great, And that was so. in sort of trying to answer your question, that's the way it would break down.
Yeah.
And there would be moments of great tension. There were fights. I saw some pretty brutal fights on that ship, you know.
Really?
Oh yeah, guys who could, particularly in the South Pacific, where it was so boring, Matt. You know, we actually on a Saturday night, the guys would dress up in their dress blues.
Yeah.
I would play music that we could pipe through the ship, and they'd dance together. And, you know,
Really?
people would say, they dance together.
Yeah.
I never saw any evidence of homosexuality.
Sure. Right.
The
Yeah.
entire time I was in the service.
Right.
And this was not in that category.
Sure.
It was just lonely.
Yeah.
Damn outright loneliness, you know? And
An incredible boredom.
an incredible boredom. I don't know how much paint we put on that damn ship. They'd have the poor guys scrape down the aft part of the ship and paint it, and then scrape down the forward part of the ship and paint that, and then scrape down what they had just painted on the aft and paint that again. And you know, anything to keep them occupied, you know, because that was a real problem. You give these people enough time to sit around with nothing to do, and it's like a can of gasoline with a match.
And let me just ask you a couple dates here that
Sure.
were happening when you were, you know, still on the Coast Guard. When Germany surrendered, do you remember that, or
Yep.
do you remember
Oh, yeah.
where you were when you heard that?
Yes. That was when we were in the Panama Canal.
Heading out to the
Heading out
Pacific.
to the Pacific. And then we were in Honolulu when the job surrendered.
Was that a surprise to you or you knew
No.
that their end was coming
We knew
any
We
day
knew
now?
after D-Day, it was just a matter of time.
Okay.
You know?
When Roosevelt died,
Yep,
do you remember that
Yep.
at all? Hearing that,
yep.
where were you at that
I
point?
wasn't that stricken, I must admit.
Yeah, I mean, he was kind of expected. He was.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But did that? I mean, was the country very much affected? I mean, here's a guy who
Oh, from what
that took you through the
from what
Depression,
we
through the
got,
war, and everything like that.
From the news that we got was mostly newspapers,
Okay.
and from the papers we read, you know, they were greatly affected. by
Yeah.
this. And I meant the hell, the man had been president forever,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and you know, and as you said much earlier in this conversation, whether you loved him or hated him, you know, he still was the president of the United
Absolutely.
States.
Yeah.
And he still was a towering figure.
Yeah.
It still is. All those people are. You know, I've watched this movie called The Gathering Storm. I think I told you about it.
About
With
Winston
Winston
Churchill.
Churchill?
Yeah.
And you realize what a, again, to use that expression, towering figure this man was.
Yeah.
And so, in his own way, was Hitler.
Absolutely.
I mean, as obscene and as evil as that man was, you know, what he was able to accomplish from his background is astounding.
Okay. Last question.
Yeah.
Life at sea. Did you finally come to like it, or?
I got used to it.
Okay, so you accepted it.
I got over seasickness.
Yeah.
And once you learn to ride that motion, it's okay.
Yeah. Si, I got to tell you, that's an incredible story.
It's
And
been fun telling you.
it's
been fun, and yet I want to reemphasize the fact that it certainly wasn't all fun. And I certainly, for those people who paid the ultimate price for that, there's no way we could repay that. No way. I'm just lucky. I was
well,
one of the
yeah,
lucky ones.
and to those people, and to people like yourself and stuff like that, you know, there's a great debt and stuff. And I thank you very much for being here.
Matt,
and
as always.
I tell you, it is fun listening to you. Thank you very much
It
for
was fun
joining
being
us.
with you.
Good night now.